go. So welcome, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to introduce to you now in our November group coaching, our monthly great terminology group coaching, a person whom I thought would never get older. Klaus, for me, you are kind of, 30, 30 plus.
That's nice, thank you.
But then in Facebook, I learned not many days ago that you are 2 times 25. So amazing. Yes. Happy birthday again, Klaus. We know each other since ages. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Klaus to all of you. He is, as I said earlier, he's the Trados guy, the Trados reseller, also for ages in Austria, but developed his own tools in his great company, Kaleidoscope, who really focuses on terminology and terminology management. He will tell us a little bit also about his company and himself. Dear Klaus, the floor is yours. This is our terminology group coaching group. We do that since 2.5 years, I think, and I enjoy it so much. The feedback I get from you guys is always very encouraging. People say, yeah, this is helpful. The peer group is excellent, and so we solve actually all the questions and the issues you have all together in that group. And today, Klaus, the floor is yours for one of the core issues: how to cope with all these nasty glossaries and translation memories. How to do that in a decent and professional way. So please, okay. Klaus, enlighten us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. The floor is mine, but not the presentation, right?
Yes. Sorry, that's the security issue. Yeah. Here we go. Now it should work.
Yeah, now it does. And let me share. So of course, I prepared a slide deck for you. I also prepared a couple of videos from all the kinds of things we can do. But as Gabriele, I think, mentioned in the introduction, it is also supposed to be interactive. So feel free to ask. You know, everybody who does know me knows that I can talk forever on the topic of terminology. So, you know, do jump in and interrupt. Yes, so as Gabriela said, I should introduce who I am and who I'm from. So I'm actually founder and CEO of a company called Kaleidoscope. And Kaleidoscope has, as a claim of fame, it has taken your content global. So we really have to, or we really deal with everything that has to do with managing, distributing content on a global level. So of course, one very big chunk of that is translation. We have a translation service company, which is a 100% daughter company, as we say in German. Oh, interesting. How come this is German? That's funny. Oh yeah, okay. Well, we'll translate it on the fly. How come I put the German? Is the rest also in German? I sent it to you, Gabriele. No, the rest is in English. So I'm sorry, I will translate this on the fly. So we have a translation service division, essentially. A big part of what we do is terminology. And I have to say, our focus on terminology is on the, let's say, large scale level. So it's less so on how does a freelancer manage terminology. For that, there's a tool like Multiterm where you can just do it. But our focus really is how do large global corporations, organizations, governments, whatever, do that. We also have a branch of what we do that has to do with quality management. And then, of course, content and automation. Again, sorry, but there's a small little German class included today in my presentation. So content and automating everything around content delivery, content management, this is also something we do. And the way we do this, the way we deliver this to our customers is either as a solution that actually works in English as well. German uses a lot of English terms, or as what we call managed service. So what that basically means is we have companies that just buy our software and then just use it and run with it. And we hear from them when there's a problem or they want to change something. Or we also deliver it as a managed service, increasingly so in the last 15, 18 months, particularly when customers want to outsource a lot. So we can just host the software, we can take over the administration, we can even take over the entire process management around terminology. So if we have a company that says, I know we should manage terminology, but we just don't have the people to do it. Then we can take over certain aspects of that as an outsourcing partner. We primarily sell software and implement software. So in the translation box, essentially, we, as you said, Gabriele, we are a big partner of Trados. We have been a Trados reseller since 1996. So that's a long time. Everybody who still remembers, that was still Multiterm 95. The good old DOS-based Trados and good old tag editor. And well, I shouldn't use the word good, but the old tag editor. So yeah, very, very interesting days back then when they thought you could translate line by line, even if that meant that a sentence ends in the middle and half a sentence starts. We, of course, also have multi-term in our portfolio, simply because if you do localization-oriented terminology, particularly on a smaller scale, maybe even by yourself, multi-term is a perfect tool to do that. We also have things like Congri Acrolinks as partners, and in our portfolio, some of you might know those companies. This is basically the, let's say, the big shots authoring support systems. So what they help you to do is they help you write content that agrees to all sorts of rules. One of these rules is terminology, but it can go into totally different areas as well. Is it findable? Is it understandable? Is it politically correct? All of these things can nowadays be verified by these tools. But as you also said, Gabriele, we started developing our own tools. QuickTerm and CheckTerm, those are all the two of the tools that I will show you a little bit today, and that we essentially developed. Why did we do that? Well, if you remember the good old Trados solutions, they were good solutions from, let's say, an architectural point of view, etc. But for a large organization, they were difficult to implement. And we found that in our terminology projects, that if you are, you know, a full-term professional terminologist, you understand these tools. But if you're not, it's very difficult to understand these tools. So they're just very complicated, honestly, just very boring for a person who is not a terminologist. So what we try to focus on is make terminology easy to understand, easy to digest, as for people who don't really have a lot to do with it. But I mean, that's 99.9% of the people in an organization. And also we are very process driven. This obviously has to do with the fact that I'm from a Germanic country, and Germanic countries love processes. So QuickTerm is a tool that lets you define terminology processes and live them, as opposed to, for example, Multiterm, where you simply cannot do that. You have an entry, you can edit it, you can restrict rights, you can filter, but it's not a workflow tool. You cannot say, hey, I don't know, Maria, would you please give me a definition? And then Judith, could you please make sure that that definition is actually correct? And then I can't see anybody else in the participant list. Gabriele, can you please do a final sign off? So these kind of things is what we do with QuickTerm. I'm going to jump over the other two because it's less interesting, I think, for this particular audience. So having said that, our main focus is really on this, let's say, large scale terminology management. I would like to do a little intro on how we actually see terminology, what we think is the problem with terminology in this very particular use case. There are other use cases, but this is the one that we primarily deal with. And I think this was also why I was invited under this topic of how do I actually harmonize all these different data sets and yeah, different terminologies. If you're lucky enough to have more than one, how do we actually harmonize that, and how can we agree on something on a larger scale? Feel free to interrupt me. I heard some noise. I'm not sure if that was just background or somebody wanted to say something. But I think you can always raise your hand or something like that. There's one thing in the chat. Yes, I'll give you the email address later. I thought there might have been a question. Right, so how do we see terminology? Well, for us, terminology has to do with content quality. Remember, we say taking your content global, so everything has to do with content. So what we think is, if you write content, what you want to do is you want to have consistent and correct content. And what does that typically mean? And don't worry that this is German, because this is just some language. It really doesn't matter in terminology what language you're talking about. But what's important is you want to be consistent. So what you want to avoid is colleague A uses this term with the number 2. Colleague B uses it with 2 written out and no hyphens. Colleague number 3 uses a totally different term. And at the end of the day, colleagues don't understand each other, translators don't understand, and ultimately the users don't understand whether you're talking about the same thing or something else. And of course, in terminology, what you do is you have a concept-oriented approach, as all of you know. I don't have to explain that here. So basically, we group all these words. We say, well, they all belong to the same concept. And then we label them and we say, okay, the difference between term A and term B is that this one is preferred and that one is deprecated. This, of course, is very simplified. It's not always that easy. Sometimes this is preferred for content type A, or this is preferred for product type A, or for company A, but for company B, actually, it's the other way around. So, of course, there are things like that, but that gets very complicated to explain to people unlike you who don't yet know too much about terminology. So this is the consistency, always using ideally the same word for the same thing. And then in terms of correctness, what we want to make sure is that if somebody actually uses this term, do they actually mean the same thing that we want them to mean with it, which is then the concept. And for that, easy ways to do that is, for example, giving them a definition so that they can make sure, yes, this really is what I am referring to, or giving them a video or an image or something like that. And of course, this happens in all languages. So we have customers that do this in 60 languages, 80 languages. And the thing that always surprises my customers most is that terminology is not a one-to-one relationship. This is something that normally takes a very long time to explain, particularly to IT people who have a very structured way of thinking and a very database or, let's say, spreadsheet kind of thinking. And in these screenshots, I think you see it fairly easily, because in German we have 6 different terms, 5 of which are forbidden. But of course, in English, there's only 1. Why is that? Because this particular company, their source content is German. So they want to have a very stringent control on what terms do we actually use in German. In English, apparently, there is only one way of putting this, although I would argue you could also write TWO instead of the number 2. So maybe it's not quite okay in terms of quality, the English version of this. But what is clear is, okay, we have 6 terms here, we have 1 here, we have 3 in French, we have 2 in Italian, we have 2 in Spanish. So this is not a one-to-one relationship. And that's part of the problem I always find in the question, how do I get terminology into different language? A lot of people say, well, send me an Excel list and I will just translate everything into the other language. That gets very complicated, because what do I do with all these forbidden terms? I mean, of course, I could invent forbidden terms in the other language, but that really makes no sense. Or the other way around, if I have a language where there really is only 1 term, because for some reason there is no obvious forbidden term, but you would to translate that into German, where we do have to make sure we never use this and never use that. How do you translate 1 Excel cell into 6? You can't do that either. So this is something very specific. Of course, for a terminologist, this is obvious. We're talking about concepts. It's all the same concept. It really doesn't matter how many terms a particular concept has in a particular language. But when we talk to people that are not terminologists, this is very difficult to understand. And I assume some of you have had similar experiences. Right, so this is what we want. Why do we want this? Well, we want this because we want our users to actually understand our content. We want it to be intelligible, user-friendly, readable, etc., etc. But that's not the only reasons companies want terminology. There are several other reasons which might actually be easier to argue or to get a budget for, particularly, because at the end of the day, if you talk to a CEO and you say, well, you know what, our users really need more user-friendly information, at the end of the day, it's very difficult to convince C-level people that this actually is important, because people buy our products anyhow. If they don't understand the information, they'll go in and Google, somebody will help them. Or I've heard quotes like, we're the only one that actually sells this product. Our customers are so happy if they finally have it, they don't actually need information. So it gets really difficult to tell these people, you know what, you need to invest on terminology. But there are some other reasons you need terminology. Single source publishing is something that has become commonplace, content management systems. So the days where an author actually creates a document and starts on page 1 with the title page and the table of content and ends all the way on page 300 and has the luxury of reading it 8 times to make sure it's consistent and correct. Those times are over. Nowadays, people write fragments. So you write some little fragment that gets used in some content somewhere on a website or in a support article or in a document or who knows where. And the notion of the document is gone. So you really can't read it to make sure it's consistent. So there, we do need something to control terminology. Otherwise, it's pre-programmed to be inconsistent. Another very interesting thing that has been happening recently is there has been, particularly also in the last year and a half, there has been a very increased focus on content used in the marketing sphere. And I'm not talking about the normal marketing content like websites. I'm also talking about things like product literature, user manuals, all kinds of things. They're all being used and they're all being made available and accessible to everyone, essentially, in the web. And what's really important there, of course, is that your content gets found. So one of my examples always is I don't know, I have the famous coffee making example, which was really a nightmare when I ordered my new coffee maker and it didn't work. And I had the hardest time figuring out why it didn't work. And the user manual couldn't tell me anything. And I ended up not even Googling it, but looking for it in YouTube. My kids helped me. And finally, I figured out that I have to program the timer. But there was like nothing in the product literature. There was nothing I could Google about. Why? Because I simply didn't know what to Google for. And this is becoming a problem for our customers because documentation is available online. But if you don't know what to search for, you're not going to find it. I have another example. Our dishwasher broke the other day. I was trying to figure out through the user manual what I can do. I couldn't in the printed user manual. There was nothing there that helped me at all. So I started Googling. I didn't get to the actual manufacturer. So their content was not search engine optimized. I couldn't find it. And I found some weird tech reviews, you know, these online forums where people help each other. And there I did actually find the solution. It was an interesting solution. They just suggested unplugging it and plugging it in the other way around. I have no idea why that would help, but it helped. So our dishwasher works again. But the big problem here is I have no idea if that's a hack that will eventually destroy the dishwasher. If the company actually approves this. So what would have been ideal is if I had retrieved some sort of an article that comes from the actual manufacturer's troubleshooting base or whatever, that gives me real information on what I can do. And if I were that company, I would have links there that says, call our service desk here, buy the spare part here, order our technician to come, pay 150 euros just to show up, because then terminology actually turns into money. And that, of course, is interesting. Another thing that makes terminology important this might be a little bit specific of the German-speaking region, because a lot of German-speaking organizations, companies, they have this brilliant idea that their corporate language should be English. And what ends up happening is you have a lot of people that are writing English texts, but they're non-natives. And of course, terminology is a big problem here. You know, there's so many ways of saying automatization and stuff like that in English, which is of course just simply wrong. But most people who are German natives struggle with that word. And of course, if you had a term base and it says automation is how you say that, then you can help these people as well. So these are kind of also things to consider where terminology can be very important. And okay, so that sounds fair enough and easy enough. We want to communicate consistently and correct. But what does this actually look like in one of our client organizations? So for example, we have this company who built this thing. This essentially is a thing that you can detach from the machine. In this case, it was a welding machine. You can walk around in the room, get close to the stuff you're trying to weld. It was a welding robot, so it's not a small welding machine, but a huge welding machine. So you can get close to the car you're trying to weld or whatever you're doing, and you can control it from there rather than having to do that from 10 meters away, and it's kind of hard to actually do it. And what is this thing called? Well, it's called an FRC30. I mean, that's what it actually says on here, right? That's the name for it, obviously. It's also called a battery operated controller. It's also called a remote. It's also called this. It's also called that. It's called all of these things. And why is that? That's not because people are intentionally mean to the user, but that is because if you look at a company and the way products and things and content evolves in a company, it typically hits different divisions. So for example, it could be that there's a research department somewhere that says, wouldn't it be cool if our users could detach our control unit and walk around in the room while they, control the unit? And then they come from a very, let's say, technical point of view. Their background is technical, but not as technical as developers. So they think more about, well, what does this thing actually need to be able to do? And then the obvious word for them is, well, it's a detachable controller. Because it's detachable, you can take it off the machine, you can walk around, and you can still control the machine. So this is the very obvious word they would use for it. And why would anybody ever use a different word for it? It's the obvious choice. But this then gets developed. So it goes to some mechanical engineers or software engineers, and they program it or build it or something like that. And they run into a problem because they say, hey, we need a battery in this thing. We never needed to worry about batteries in our controllers because they were always on the machine. So they had a power supply. Now, all of a sudden, they need a battery. And for them, that's the big thing. This is what differentiates these controllers from all other ones. So of course, it has to be called the battery operated whatever. I put the XYZ because it's not really important. So they might have actually spent time thinking about what to call these things, but they come from a different background. They have a different purpose for that term, so they come up with a different one. Product management always obviously says, well, we need to put this in our ERP system. To start with, I only have 8 characters because somebody designed the system like that. Secondly, I already have an FRC10 and an FRC20, so obviously we're going to have to call it FRC30 because it's cooler and more expensive than the other ones. So this is an obvious choice. That's fine, actually, because this becomes the product name, and that's perfectly valid that there's a product name, but another term as well. And then typically in companies that actually produce something, there's one division that screams first, and that is normally the technical documentation department. Why? Because they basically have to take all this input and they have to produce manuals. They have to tell their users, how do we actually use this thing? And on top of it, they have yet another point of view, because what they think about is the end user. They say, what is easy to understand for my end user? Is it even important that it's battery operated? I mean, who cares if it's battery operated, honestly? For the particular term and how to actually use it, that doesn't matter. It's important for the engineer. It's important for the software developer. And that's where you get these, classical documentation written by software engineers that says, if you click this button, the program will do this and that. And at the end, it will store this and that here and there. Nobody really cares about this. But for the programmer, that's the ingenious thing that a function does. So typically they scream and they say, hey guys, we need to, reduce the amount of words we use for this. But it doesn't end there, because at the end of the day, you have a marketing division that says, this is all cool, but nobody's going to buy it with that boring name. So they come up with yet another one. In this case, just for fun, I spelled it with this typical camel case, large C in the middle of the name, and they might have even trademarked it to make it very special. This couple of years ago, this is where it would have ended. But fortunately, life gets more complicated. And nowadays, what people and companies and organizations actually start taking into account is the user. What does the user actually call this? Because if the user has a problem and the user goes on Google and says, please tell me how this thing works, they need to know what to look for. So potentially they are actually going to Google for FRC30 because it says FRC30 on the thing that they have in the hand. They're probably not going to Google for battery operated, something like that. They might Google for remote control, but there might be 18 different things they could Google on. And that's what we need to find out. So if we take terminology management all the way nowadays and we say, well, we want to be findable, optimized for online content, we do have to think about what is the highest click rate, what is the highest search volume, how do people actually search for that. I know that's a little bit more than just terminology, because there's also different search behavior. For example, Germans only Google for nouns. All of those of you who are German will appreciate that. We would only Google for nouns, whereas, for example, English speakers, they would Google for something. Why does my controller not work? German speakers would never do that. It doesn't occur to them to ask a question. They just say controller empty or something like that, and expect Google to find something. So yes, it's a bit more than terminology, but it is very interesting. And I see this a lot nowadays, that you need to start taking these things into account when you create content. And there's one very, very nice aspect about that. Companies worry about that. Even CEOs worry about that, because they want their users to find their content. So what that means is all of a sudden there might actually be money for terminology, because it increases the traffic on your site. It might increase the amount of spare parts you sell, because people find them more easily. So this might actually increase the revenue, which was always a little bit hard to talk about when we talk about terminology. How do I sell more products just because I have good terminology? So this is a little bit how we see the world. It also doesn't end there. This is also a phenomenon that is getting worse and worse. Companies merge and acquire other companies all the time. So what happens is, not only do we have different philosophies, different worldviews in one company from one division to the next, we actually have different worldviews of entire companies clashing with each other, because obviously if company A absorbs company B, there are different wordings and speech and terminologies, and how do I even talk to my customer? This is normally entirely different from one company to the other. And of course, the solution is terminology, just plain terminology. So it's the concept. You define a concept. You say, what are we even talking about? We're talking about this thing. What is it? What does it do? How do we explain it? How do we make sure people understand what they're talking about? And then you basically assign all the words, and you tag them to put it in a non-terminological view. So you could say, for example, remote control, that should be our standard term. Usage is standard or preferred, or whatever you want to call it. We do allow the product name. So if you do actually refer to the product, it's okay to say FRC30. At the end of the day, it's even printed on the product itself. So that's fine. Remote control spelled like that, this is only okay if we are writing search engine optimized text. All the rest we reject. As I said, this is very black and white, very simplified. It's not always that easy. So it might be rejected for this kind of content, for this kind of, or for company A, it's rejected, but for company B, it's actually okay still for the next 2 years or something like that. So this is what we need. Well, we need to come to this agreement. But of course, the question is, how do you actually do that in a large organization? How do you make sure we all agree on that? We all understand the same thing. We all agree on the different terms. So this is
Klaus,
kind of where we
Klaus,
come
may I
from.
ask you, this
Please.
would also be the solution for various clients, yeah, to tag their terminology, right?
What do you mean with various
clients? Because this was the question last time. How do I manage all these different glossaries from different clients? You know, so
yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So again, the important thing is the concept. So what you would need to make sure first is, are these different clients actually talking about the same thing? Is it really the same thing? And if it is the same thing, then yes, you would say, well, usage client A, usage client B, or you could do something like allowed for client A but rejected for client B. So there are different flavors of how you want to model the metadata here, but essentially you just list everything and then you tag it. Of course, if it's not the same thing, so if client B just has a completely different kind of control, it's a different entry, and then we don't worry, because you'll only find control 1 if we're writing about control 1, and control 2 if we write about control 2.
Thank you. Please, guys, also just unmute yourself and just ask questions.
Yep. I'll pause because I'm actually gonna go into a little bit of a different direction. So,
Charles, I see that you're here. You were raising some issues last time. Maybe you want to jump in the discussion and ask questions. You can unmute yourself.
I wasn't here last time, so I don't know.
I think it's very, very interesting. My questions come about because you have sometimes the same acronym, which refer to some different objects. We had someone the other day who just thought it was a brilliant idea to call their system the Gripen Publication System, GPS. Well, GPS can't be used for any other reason, right?
Yep.
No, of course. So anyway, so they're completely different contexts and concepts, but you can have other things that are actually even closer that's more scary because they become really difficult to delineate and differentiate between them.
Yeah, and that's when you need definitions. When it gets really close, you need to say, okay, well, this is actually one kind of this, but it has the following specific properties, whereas the other one has other specific properties. And acronyms, I mean, this is sort of an acronym. I unfortunately can't tell you what it stands for because the F is the company name. RC actually stands for remote control. You might have guessed that. So this actually is an acronym, and acronyms in terminology, of course, they're nothing else but also terms. They're synonyms. And then you could say, okay, well, this one is allowed, this one is forbidden. So for the, I forgot, publication system or something like that, I would probably label GPS as a forbidden acronym because it's normally used for something else. And this is one of the rules of terminology that, if possible, you shouldn't go 180 degrees against normal natural language usage. And the rest of the world just thinks GPS is the global positioning system.
If I have a question, it would be regarding the use of definitions, because I find that they're very, very time consuming and extremely hard to get right. So we've gone to a metadata based system where as soon as you have 15 metadata points, then you have a word defined, period.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm not the kind of person that says definitions are always a must. The word definition comes from Latin, and it means keep apart or draw a border around something. So I think a definition you need if there are concepts that are very similar, or there are similar sub-concepts maybe of a concept, then a definition is nice because it's easy to say, I don't know, whatever, a combustion engine is an engine that burns some sort of fuel, versus an electric motor, as you would say in English, funnily. It's basically the same thing, but it doesn't burn fuel, it just uses electricity. So there you might want to have a definition because it makes it very easy to keep them apart. But absolutely, I mean, having metadata sets, or also something like just putting it inside an ontology or inside a network of concepts. How shall I say that? For example, if you know that an ingot is something that falls out of a casting plant, you could simply draw a picture and say, okay, I have a casting plant. We all know what that is. And then you have an arrow that says produces or outputs or I don't know, something like that. And then you put ingot. That's perfectly valid if that helps you people understand the concept. It goes into knowledge graphs and stuff like that.
But not the IKEA style, right? Hopefully.
Not too simple.
What else,
All right.
guys? Any further questions so far? All good? Well done, please, Klaus, go ahead.
Yeah, so the cliffhanger was, how do you do that in a large organization? And of course, what you need is processes. It's what Gabriele always also says, one of the biggest problem of large-scale terminology projects is the fact that they don't have processes.
And I always start with people. No. People come before processes.
True, but it's even harder for us to provide people. We can help them with processes, but we can't help them with people unless you outsource it. And they need responsibilities. So not only people, but they also need to know what they're responsible for. So this generally is not our job. This generally is your job to come up with these things. We can then help implement that in a system. So what you also need is you need a system where you can assign stuff to people, where you can notify people and say, hey, there's 15 new things. Can you please have a look and let us know if they're okay for you or something like that? So you need to-do lists. Nobody wants to log in the database and filter to something to figure out what they need to do. You need a clear to-do list, ideally with priorities. So, you know, if you have 200 things to work on, which one should I do first? Deadlines, it should be clear for you what to do. And what I also find very intriguing is there needs to be communication and ideally documented communication, because typically what happens, obviously, if you discuss a concept and you want to agree on a preferred term, or you want to agree on the definition, or where to place it in the knowledge graph or something like that, there is going to be a discussion. There is going to be communication between the different people. Typically that happens in a meeting or via email or via a phone call. And in 2 years, if you want to remember what you discussed back then, it's normally not there anymore. So we think the communication should be on some platform. Of course, you can do all that in our tool. You don't have to. I obviously prefer you to do that. But particular communication, for example, you can also do that in Teams or Slack or something like that. The advantage of doing it on one single platform is, of course, it's then linked to that particular entry. On Slack, you would have to go back 2 years later and see where is our thread where we discussed this particular entry. So those are exactly the thing that we do in our system and that we believe are important. And we are not the only ones that think this is important. I stole this from Gabriele or borrowed it from Gabriele. So this was a survey Termnet ran a few years ago. Maybe some of you actually participated in the survey that was asking what are the largest challenges. And this was the result. So it's very interesting. I'm not that wrong with consistency and correctness, except that it's not spelled correctly, as I just saw. That's kind of funny. But actually, the number one thing that organizations said is a problem is lack of awareness, meaning people are not aware what happens if you use the wrong terminology. They're not aware that there even is a terminology. And that is the typical thing if you talk to a colleague somewhere at the, I don't know, in the cafeteria, and you talk about an acronym and why do you use this, and what you will hear is, I've always used that. You know, it doesn't even occur to them that maybe it's used differently in a different division. As I said, none of them typically do it intentionally. There might be occasions where it is intentional, but typically it's not intentional that people use different words for different things. And of course, what I always hear from all organizations and customers and not yet customers, particularly the not yet customers, is they'll say, well, we have no people, we have no money, we have no time, and we have no processes. And of course, we cannot directly help with giving, you know, people money and time to customers. But what we can help, of course, is make this as efficient as possible. So you only spend the amount of people, money, and time that is really necessary. That we can help with if we have a structured and efficient and lean process in place. So that's kind of what we do in our software. So if you look at the different areas that our software works in, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the software and then show a couple of actual use cases that have to do with how do I collect and harmonize, etc. But just so you understand what our software actually does, we focus on these 4 areas. So obviously you need to be able to manage terminology. So obviously you need to be able to create stuff and edit it. As I said, we're focusing strongly on process to discuss, validate, approve, quote unquote, translate, research, target language equivalence, but that's just a very long word. So translate is easier to understand by lay people also. Then we focus on rolling it out. As I said, awareness is one big problem. So what can we do to make people more aware? Well, one thing we can do is we can make it as easy as possible for them to use the system, make it nice looking, not a lot of features, not a lot of information, make it fast. We have things on our platform like you can put entries of the week there. Those of you who follow the various entries of the week that exist on social media, that's actually really nice because people really enjoy that. You can log on to the term base once a month and check out the 4 or 5 entries of the week of last month, and you learn something about terminology. You learn something that is hopefully useful for yourself, for your company, for your, I don't know, work, or maybe even for your daily life. We've had one customer, for example, that said, well, it's now November, people now get sick. How do you say bless you in 20 languages? That's not really terminology, but it's helpful, and it makes people come to the term base to learn these things. We have companies that run terminology quizzes online. We also have terminology quiz functionality on our platform. And that also is something that people just really enjoy. You're not logging on to a boring platform where you have to manually type in something, search, and then you have to set 15 filters until you find it. But you log on to a platform and hey, you can take a terminology quiz and have fun and learn something and maybe actually even win something. When we run our quizzes, we like to do that at conferences, and then we actually give away a tablet, for example, and that incentivizes people quite a bit if you can win a tablet. Can't do that as a freelance translator, of course, at least not money. But yeah. And people really enjoy it. I often meet skeptics that say, you know, who has time to take in a terminology? But not true. People do that. An example at the conference of the German Terminology Association, some of you might know it, the Deutsche Terminologie. We ran a term quiz for, I think, an hour or so, and out of the 250 participants or something like that, almost everybody took part. Was 220 participants, so 30 did not take part. I like to think probably didn't have some device that was on, and people were really eager to win. It was funny because it was like the first place for a while, answered the 5 questions correctly in 10 seconds. And then after a while, somebody beat that and got down to 8 seconds. And then after a while, somebody did seconds. So you can really competitive and they want to win. You can use that just to make terminology interesting, because at the end of the day, the questions are all about terminology, and people learn not only the actual terminology, but they learn why terminology is important if you ask interesting questions. Obviously, you don't need a tool to run a term quiz. You can do that in any format, really, cards or in the, I don't know, or in the company brochure, whatever you want to do. But it's particularly sexy to have it on the platform because you drive the traffic to the platform.
Klaus, we have a question here. Your line is not the best today, but where are you sitting? Huh?
In the office as well.
Oh, really? So Carl is asking, I'm looking at terminology management from the LSP perspective, but it may be similar for a freelancer. Does your tool set allow me to create an inventory of all term bases we have for many clients to cross-reference? Oops, sorry, now I lost the entry. It's here again. Sorry. To cross-reference or search for terms across different term bases. For instance, if we have different clients in the same vertical subject matter area, to create reports on duplicates or differences across different term bases, etc.
Yes, absolutely. You can search across term bases. You can find duplicates across term bases. You could output it in some way as maybe a Excel file. At the end of the day, Excel is always very useful in batch outputting or batch editing or batch importing something. I'll have videos on how we handle Excel in a while. So yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
And it's always a trick question whether you, I mean, as an LS, you typically create term bases, each client a different term base for data protection and many reasons. If you're in a company and let's say you have 8 different terms, I would typically recommend to only have one term base and differentiate them some metadata because it makes it easier to find. But we can include, I should almost take a step. So we have user groups in our system. And if you log into the system knows which group you're in. And you can either be in 18 every group has a different term base, and then you just have access to all of them, or the group that you belong to has access to term bases, and then you can search in all of them.
Does that answer your question, Karl? Are you fine? And Klaus, you know, I booked you for 2 hours, but only because yeah, it was the
I
option
warned
to
you.
book. But actually, our terminology group coaching is for 1 hour. You know that, right?
No, I thought I have 2 hours.
No, come on.
Okay, then I have to hurry up because I have like half an hour of videos waiting.
And like with many LSPs, the situations, of course, like in German we say das Kind ist schon in den Brunnen gefallen. We already have like tons of different term bases, of course, and in a ideal situation you would set it up the way you proposed. But the challenge is once you already have the mess of X clients and maybe even more than one glossary for the same client, depending on their internal divisions, then how do you pull them all together and not lose overview of what you have in terms of assets actually?
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, multiple term bases is not a problem for us. Also, terminology checking against multiple term bases is not a problem. In the detail, it becomes, of course, a little bit technical because every term base will have different languages and different fields and etc. So there is a bit of configuration you need to do because, for example, for terminology checking, which is another thing that we do, you need to let the system know how do I find out if a term is allowed or not. And that can be different in your 18 different term bases. It could be the field usage with the status approved in one of them. It could be, I don't know, term status with deprecated in the other one. And so then there's quite some clicking until it understands 18 different ways of doing the same thing. But
harmonizing attributes and the meta terms you use to organize your term base would be a great progress already.
Yeah, or not, or you just map it, and you know, if you look, for example, for the status value, our system can say, well, you will find that in this field in term base A, you'll find it in a different field in term base B, and yet another in term base C.
Right. Cool. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Right. So since you told me I don't actually have 2 hours, let me jump ahead a little bit.
I told you before. you
I
don't
must have
listen
somehow...
to me properly. That's the problem, I think.
That could be. So what I prepared a little bit is because the question was, how do you harmonize this? How do you get different content into one term base? What can be the processes there? As you know, I'm Germanic, so I'm all for processes. And I think it's very essentially different whether you're talking about the source language or the target languages. And the main reason is in the source language, although of course the term base doesn't really have the notion of a source language because you can just switch it over. But I do think that there's an initial process you need to do, which has to do with the fact that you need to figure out, is this even a concept? Do we even want to include that? If it is a concept, what's the definition? What is the metadata? How do we fit it into our concept map? All of that stuff. And I personally think a lot of that is no longer relevant for the target languages because you've already done it for the source language. If you discover, wait a second, it is somewhere completely different in our concept map in a target language, very likely then you did something wrong in the target language terminology research. So the processes are different in the source language than in the target languages. There's another question that says, does it work online? So yeah, the software works online. It's cloud-based. You can also install it on premise if you want to, but most customers just use it online. And yes, there is actually a way to test the software. Let me put that in here. Is it? I'm not 100% sure this is the right link, but I think it is. So, oh, now I only sent it to one person. Let me send it again. So if you log on to our demo site, demo.kaleidoscope.at, you will find a link there that says quick term. And if you click on that, you're in the software. Also, you'll find a little PDF there that explains to you how this is set up and what you can exactly test there. Because of course, it's very configurable. It can look completely different for 2 different people or groups. Right, so coming back to the process, I think there's 3 ways you do terminology work. Particularly in the beginning, I think there's a lot of batch processing. So you do stuff offline. For example, terminology extraction, you do offline, then you have a list of 300 new candidates, and you bring the process, harmonize them and validate. There is, of course, the systematic approach where you say, I have this new product, I have a certain subject matter, I have a document, whatever the scope is, and I really want to sit down and systematically work on that particular thing and collect the terminology for it. There's also an ad hoc process. Ad hoc process means some spontaneously needs something. So, for example, a software developer wants to put on a button, so they need a word that they can put on that particular button. If they can't find it, they can just spontaneously request. And things sometimes even in parallel. And how do we do this? Put together videos because it's hard to show all that live. So basically, I found this interesting document on thin slide casting. And what I want to do is I want to do some process of this. So what I typically do is I would do it extraction and come up with these term candidates that I somehow want to get into my term base. Of course, I have a term base with certain field structure. So what we like to do is we like to prepare an Excel template that contains exactly the fields I want to import. So I would go here, I would say, well, I want English, I want the term, I want usage, I want note. All of these things should be in my Excel template. And then I just generate that template. We do work strongly with Excel, particularly for these batch functionalities. So I have produced my very specific Excel template with the fields that I want. And maybe just an aside, why do we do specific templates? This is what it can look like, by the way. Well, because it could be that you have 30 fields in your term base and 60 languages, and you cannot export that to Excel anymore because Excel can only handle 265 columns. So then you need to think about, okay, how do I break this down? Because it's just too big as an Excel file for Excel to open. Of course, you could cheat and use some open source software that can still open it. But honestly, if you have 265 columns as a human being, that's also going to be hard to work with. So I create my own specific template. I say these are exactly the fields I want to have available. And then I would just copy and paste my stuff in there. And this particular Excel format is actually concept oriented. So what we have is in the first column, we have the concept ID. And of course, in this case, these are all new. I want to create them. So there is no concept ID. And then we have this, it's just, we just made that up. We said, okay, if it contains an asterisk or a star, this very often is, if you're into genealogy, for example, that means it was born. So that's why we use the star, because we want to bring this new concept to life, if you want to put it that way. And then, for example, we can put project numbers into the database. And the really nice thing about Excel, of course, is if this is true for all the concepts, we can just copy and paste it down the entire spreadsheet. There's a shortcut key that lets you do that as well. So you can include information for your terms for each and every concept, because very often in these batch processes, that's the way it is. Obviously not for the definition. So here I'm just going to go in here and yield this paragraph here as a definition. It's just a demo anyhow. Then I couldn't find my Excel sheet. Of course, the definition you don't want to copy paste to each concept. That won't make any sense. But for example, we could include the usage as well. So we could say I want to include them all as standard term. There we go. We can add notes if we want to, and we can just import this right back to the term base. So if I go here, and then I have an import template also set up, I can say which file do I want to import. We can also do this automatically. So if you have a folder where you just throw your Excel files, we can just automatically import them as well. But here it's a manual process, and then I say next, and it just imports all of these entries. Wait a little bit, or I can just fast forward a bit. So we got a file, obviously, that tells us exactly what we've done. And then we look into the term base. The term base was empty before I started that. Then we can, okay, these are the things that I have imported, plus all the information that we added in Excel. So even the definition, of course, that's all there. We can merge, certainly, like you can in multi-term, for example. So we can merge on term, for example, or if you did know the concept IDs, we could merge on concept IDs as well. And then what we would do is we would use our workflow and we would send these things into approval. So depending on how your approval processes even work, you could have complicated ones like this 3-step approval that I have here with deadlines, very exact deadlines, even to the second. And we have, of course, this communication layer where we can say, okay, we want to communicate with one another as well. And now what the system does is it sends out a task to the people that are defined in this particular workflow. So in this particular case, this was a person from the tech doc department. They now have a task, and their task now is to make sure that what we suggest here as an entry actually works for them. And as you can see, we can communicate with one another, so they can see this useful note from the terminologist. They could ask a different group something, so kind of like Slack or Teams, we can chat with each other. So I could ask my marketing colleague, what do you think? Is that okay? And then hopefully will to me. I cheated a bit in the demo, of course. Get back and say, yeah, this is fine. So I can say approve. I also agree with that. I could also say reject. So I don't actually do this in this particular video. I have another one for the 2 hours where we do actually reject it. So as you can see, there is the reject option here as well. Then it depends on your workflow. It depends on what you configured in your workflow, what happens. For example, it could be that you say, well, I send this to 30 people. If 25 approve, that's fine. You could say, if one person rejects it, cancel the whole thing because we want unanimous decisions. You could also set up workflows that says, well, it goes to that person first, then it goes to that person, and then it goes to that person. So basically, if person 3 rejects it, then the workflow stops there and goes back to the terminologist, for example. So this is how we achieve this harmonization, because we actually send it out to all these people. They can approve it. And if you remember, I also said, well, we're dealing with non-professionals. So we try to make it simple. That's why we give them a task list. They don't even have to go into the term base and find what do I need to work on. It's in their task list. We make it quite clear what they need to look at. This is what they need to look at. The chat feature, I mean, most people are used nowadays to chat functionality, so they'll be able to figure that out. And then we really only offer them a few buttons. So we offer them approve, reject. If you want, you can allow them to abstain from voting, but if that's not an option in your process, you can just get rid of that. We allow them to export all the tasks if you want. So you could narrow it down actually to only 2 buttons. And that's what I also mean with clarity. It's fairly simple to explain to people, what does it mean when you click on approve? What does it mean when you click on reject? And actually, that's all we want from you. We don't want anything else. And then at the end of the day, obviously, you get something where the workflow status is final. We track the entire history. So we know who said yes, we know who said no. We can see all the comments, as you saw. So everything is documented, retrievable. So in 2 months, if you ask yourself, why did we agree on this? This is completely wrong. You can go in here, you can look at the history, who approved it. You can look at all the comments that were given in the chat. So you can always trace back and find out why you ended up with this. This was one way to do it. This was the batch process. And I don't know about the time, Gabriele. I did prepare some other scenarios, but I don't know if people have time to stay.
Yeah, I have to ask. Actually, I don't have time to say, but I could just leave and let everything open because I have to sneak in my project meeting again. But
we could also continue next time. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I only have 1 hour. I'm sure you told me, but
but that would be ideal if you really could offer that, Klaus. I'm very grateful for a second chance to have
sure.
the rest. I think yeah.
If it's okay with everybody else, then yeah absolutely.
you guys, I think you were prepared for 1 hour, right? So that would be really cool. No.
My bad.
No, I think it was confusing that I booked you in that system for 2 hours and then said a couple of times, but please, it's 1 hour only. Yeah. Yes, great. Then Klaus, let us do that. Let us.
Yeah, let's see if I'm available again.
Yes, I will book you again.
Book me for 1 hour.
But there was no option for 1 hour. That was the thing.
Ah, okay. That could be. Well, I'm sorry, but I hope it was interesting anyhow.
It was great, Klaus. I think we definitely should continue. Yeah, from the feedback also I get, and then we really should have more time, guys. Please, in the group, please prepare your question. Think about that. Think about your worst cases, what you really are struggling with, so that we can sort it out together with Klaus. Okay, great. Great, guys. Then this was part number 1, and we are going to have a part number 2. Excellent, with much more use cases and with your questions, and great fun for everybody.
Yeah, send me the date so I can make sure I'm available.
Well, that's actually easy. It's always the first Thursday of the month, except in December. There we have the 9th. We have the 9th. So 1 week
9th.
later.
Okay.
Yeah, and it would be always 4 p.m. Central European time to 5 p.m.
I can book that. That's actually available.
Wonderful. So we have the 9th. We have the 9th of December, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Same time, same station, but only 1 week later, 9th. Excellent. Thank you so much, Klaus. Thank you so much, guys. So see you all on December 9th. Great. And I will also send out the link with the recordings of today's meeting. Great. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye. All the best. Bye-bye. See you. Thank you, Klaus. That was brilliant, as usual. Bye.